Good morning, Hassan Huskies. This is your principal, Dr. Miller. Today is Monday, March 18th, 2024. Please stand with me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, Hassan Huskies, it's birthdays. Happy birthday. All right. We have Grace and Mrs. Moline, Jennifer and Mrs. Doro, Isaac and Mrs. Petter, Dominic and Mrs. Stemick, Lucy and Mrs. Back, Athena and Mrs. Moline, Eliana and Miss Christensen. We have Marshall and Miss Christensen, Natalie and Miss Oakland, Salvador and Mrs. Dazowski, Landon and Mrs. Moline, Riley and Mrs. Petter, Ben and Mrs. Dockendorf, Brecken and Mrs. Craig, Drake and Miss Gumphrey, Beckham and Mr. Willenbring, Eliana and Mrs. Gumphrey, Alexis and Mr. Spitzak, Kira and Miss Dockendorf, Lillian and Mrs. Craig, Caleb and Mrs. Gumphrey, Lillian and Miss Dockendorf, Warren and Mrs. Craig, Lana and Miss Christensen, Liam and Mrs. Craig, Ava and Mrs. Dazowski, Ambriella and Mrs. Moline, Gavin and Mrs. Wallen, Scarlett and Miss Doro, Peyton and Mrs. Harn's class, and Levi and Miss Holloway. Happy birthday! Those are all the birthdays for the rest of March because we have spring break coming up next week. All right, Hassan Huskies, it's a great day to be a Husky. Make great choices. Listen to your teacher. Have a good day.